Doors slam, windows close, as this ominous spectacle of a man comes into the city gates of Jerusalem, crying out with his thunderous voice that same theme they keep hearing over and over, Nathash, Nathotz, Nathash, Nathotz. A cloud of dust rises up before him, even as the sheep and the goats scatter, sensing the tension of the city, as the street dogs bark at the heels of this prophet of God. Some throw stones at him from around the corners, some sneer, some mock, others shout, traitor, others plot for his life. And how they hated him when he, before the elders at the gate, dared lifting a huge earthenware vessel over his head and hurled it smashing to pieces at their feet and roared, so shall Jehovah do to you, this people and this city. That was shocking language to speak to the elders of the city, let alone to the people. Well, that shocking man with the shocking message was Yermiah in Hebrew, or we know him as Jeremiah. Jeremiah was such a bold preacher of the good news that 600 years later, when Jesus was walking the earth, we had an account in Matthew 16, 13, and 14, where some projected, this is Jeremiah resurrected, when in fact it was Jesus. Now, can you imagine the reputation of that man and his boldness and strength of prophesying living vividly in the memory of those Jews some 600 years? Well, 140 years before Buddha and Confucius, Jeremiah was prophesying a most heart-rending catastrophe to be, a thing unbelievable. He was upsetting his corner of the world with the augury and presentiment of the destruction and plundering and burning down of Jerusalem's temple, dedicated to the worship of Jehovah God, and that was unthinkable. During those critical years, there were other preachers leading down to the destruction of Jerusalem. Can we just see it in our minds? Jeremiah was stationed in Jerusalem, in Hebrew, or Jerusalem. Daniel was in the palace of the king of Babylon. Ezekiel was a prophet to the Jewish exiles by the river Kibar. And Habakkuk and Zephaniah were all over Judah. What a vanguard of fearless preachers. No wonder the country was stirred up when those men were out doing the work of God. Jeremiah began prophesying in 647 before our common era, and that was in the 13th year of the reign of the good king, the last good king, Josiah, in Jerusalem. And he preached some 40 years down to 607 BCE through the reign of the bad, unfaithful kings in this succession, King Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiakin, and finally Zedekiah, in whose reign the Babylonian armies under conquering King Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple built by Solomon. Jeremiah was the son of a Jewish priest in the city of Anathoth, which is just a walk north of Jerusalem, some 3 miles in Benjamin's territory. But the fact he was son of a priest did not mean automatically he would be a prophet. Let's turn to Jeremiah, the 1st chapter, and we see the strange and unusual circumstances that surrounded his birth. In the 5th verse, Jehovah is informing Jeremiah this way: before I proceeded to form you in the belly, I knew you. Before you began to come forth from the womb, I sanctified you. Prophet to the nations I made you. Now we're going to read on, but let's pause there. We see here this to be one of the few men for whose birth Jehovah assumed the responsibility, intervening by a miracle or guiding providence, to be his special servants. Can you think of the others? Just a few: Isaac, Samson, Samuel and John the Baptist and Jesus. Well, now, why did God choose him before he was in the womb? Well, Jehovah God could likely see the general disposition and temperament and genetic factors that would be contributed by his parents. And he could see there a working tool to perform his wills when these parents produced this child. Now, did this fix the eternal destiny of Jeremiah? No. Did this mean he was going to be a prophet? Well, he had to use his own initiative and free will to choose to do God's assigned works. He was born for the work, it's evident from what we just read, but would he fit himself to it? Well, let's look at verse 6. But I said, that's Jeremiah speaking, Alas, O Lord Jehovah, here I actually do not know how to speak, but I'm just a boy. In Hebrew, it would be a young man. Young man by comparison to the elders. How is he as a young man going to go and counsel and instruct and talk to elders? Which is a fine attitude for young men to have, having regard for older persons. Well, Jehovah went on to say to me, Don't say I am but a boy, but to all those whom I send you, you should go. And everything that I shall command you, you should speak. Don't be afraid because of their faces, for I'm with you. To deliver you is the utterance of Jehovah. And Jehovah proceeded to thrust his hand out and cause it to touch my mouth. Then Jehovah said to me, Here I have put my commission in your mouth. See, I have commissioned you this day to be over the nations and over the kingdoms, in order to Nathash in Hebrew, and to Nathats in Hebrew. Well, now, how about those terms? In order to Nathash, uproot. That's an agronomical term. Associated with agronomy or agriculture, we uproot a weed. Well, Jehovah God says you are going to uproot with your message the city of Jerusalem, Nathash. You're also to Nathats, tear down, more of an architectural term. So that theme resounded in the ears of Israel, particularly Benjamin and Judah, Israel having already been vanquished. And his commission was, indeed, to uproot and pull down, to destroy and tear down, to build and to plant. Well, he accepted the assignment. Yet, there was more required than just performing his work as a prophet. He was going to have to make a certain sacrifice as a man. And would you young men be willing to do the same? Turning to Jeremiah, the 16th chapter, what was it that Jehovah asked of him in the way of personal sacrifice? In the second verse, you must not take for yourself a wife. You must not come to have sons and daughters in this place. Why? For this is what Jehovah has said concerning the sons and daughters that are born in this place, and concerning their mothers who are giving them birth, and concerning their fathers who are becoming father to them in this land. With deaths from maladies they will die. They will not be bewailed, neither be buried. As manure on the surface of the ground they'll become. By the sword and famine they'll come to an end, and their dead bodies will actually serve as food for the flying creatures of the heavens and the beasts of the earth. Yes, Jeremiah was forbidden to marry. What if he was to preach Jerusalem was going to be destroyed by God with famine, pestilence, and disease, and he went on having all kinds of family? Well, how seriously would they take his message? So he had to remain without family responsibilities and unmarried. It was Jehovah's will at the time, due to the agonies shortly to befall them in those last days of Jerusalem. That explanation given in the 8th book under Jeremiah. Now Jeremiah was given an illustration by God in the 18th chapter showing that Jehovah wasn't being dogmatic on this matter of Nathot's uproot and tear down. He did say to build and plant. And there would have to be no need of tearing down, perhaps, if they responded in a certain way, and Jeremiah would know that from this illustration, and so would the city. He told them in the second verse, rise up and go down to the house of the potter. Now he would go down because up on Mount Moriah, the elevation is high. He'd go down to the gate of the potters where they all worked, at the gate of the city. Well, he listened. He says, I proceeded to go down to the house of the potter, and there he was doing work upon potter's wheels. Now, potter's wheels, there would be a wheel at the feet of the potter that he would set his feet on, and he would turn that wheel, and that in turn would turn a shaft, and on top of the shaft would be a smaller wheel on which the potter would grind or shapen and contour the clay with which he was working. Now, what did Jehovah God have him go watch the potter at work for? Jehovah explains to him in verse 5 and 6. He says, am I not able to do just like this potter to you people, O house of Israel? Look, is the clay in the hand of a potter, so you are in my hand, O house of Israel. At any moment that I may speak against a nation and against a kingdom to uproot Nathosh and pull it down, the thoughts, and destroy it, and that nation actually turned back from its badness against which I spoke, I will feel sorry over the calamity that I had thought to execute upon it. But at any moment that I may speak concerning a kingdom, to build it up, to plant it, and it actually does what is bad in my eyes by not obeying my voice, I will also feel sorry over the good that I said to myself to do for its good. So now say please to the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, or Jerusalem, this is what Jehovah has said. Here I am forming against you a calamity and thinking against you a thought. Turn back, please, each one from his bad way, and make your ways and your dealings good. So they had the opportunity to turn back. But did they? Well, the 23rd chapter of Jeremiah shows how the word of Jeremiah went over. The 29th verse, the accent had to be on the destruction because they would not listen. The 29th verse, is not my word correspondingly like a fire is the utterance of Jehovah, like a forge hammer that smashes the crag. No, it wasn't an easy message for the prophet to carry. Subsequently, Nebuchadnezzar came against the city. He had it in his death grip, but he didn't destroy it. He made an arrangement to place Zedekiah on the throne at Jerusalem and had him take an oath in Jehovah's name, his God's name, obliging him to be loyal to the king. And Jeremiah told Zedekiah, do you fulfill that oath? It's Jehovah's will. You not rebel against Nebuchadnezzar because he'll destroy this city. Well, some 3 years later, 609 before our common era, contrary to Jehovah's word through Jeremiah, and the oath he took in Jehovah's name, Zedekiah rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. He went to Egypt for military assistance. And he went to Egypt on the advice of the false priests who said, don't listen to Jeremiah. Jehovah never let this city fall. We've got to get rid of that invader to our holy land. Well, Egypt came up. And when Nebuchadnezzar's forces saw the troops of Pharaoh coming, they withdrew. Now, can you see all the priests of the city saying, see, we told you that's all it would take, and Jeremiah still cautioning them. The 37th chapter, let's read of the account. The Babylonians have just withdrawn, and the false prophets and the priests of Israel are saying that, no, you don't listen to Jeremiah. You see, they have gone. We told you the truth of the matter. Well, here's what Jeremiah says in the 7th verse. This is what Jehovah, the God of Israel, has said. And this is what you men should say to the king of Judah, the one sending you to inquire of me. Look, the military force of Pharaoh that is coming forth to you people for the purpose of help will go back to their land Egypt. And the Chaldeans will certainly come back and fight against this city, capture it, and burn it with fire. Don't deceive your souls, saying, the Chaldeans will without fail go away from against us, because they'll not go away. For if you men had struck down all the military force of the Chaldeans who are fighting you, and there remained over among them men pierced through, they would each one in his tent rise up and actually burn this city with fire. What's he saying there? He's saying Jehovah's word is so true that if you had actually stuck a sword or a spear through every troop of Babylon, they'd get up out of their tents and come in here and destroy this city to perform God's will. It's that invincible. You listen to what Jehovah has said. Did they? Well, it occurred when the military force of the Chaldeans had withdrawn themselves from against Jerusalem because the military force of Pharaoh. Jeremiah began to go forth into Jerusalem by the land of Benjamin. He preached that message. God was still going to destroy them. Don't take false security in that. And he began to leave for the land of Benjamin and get his portion there from the midst of the people, verse 12 says. Now, what portion of land is that? Didn't Jeremiah give all his land away to his family? He had no material possessions. Yes. But during his preaching, he promised the faithful remnant of God that if the king acted wrongly and Nebuchadnezzar did come in and take the city, that God would restore his faithful ones. And to show his confidence in that, he bought some land. And if he were that sure of it, it lent impact to his message. Well, now, as he's leaving the city of Jerusalem, because it's going to be destroyed, it's inevitable, since Zedekiah is not listening to God's message, he's going through the gates, just north, to his plot of ground. And look what happens in verse 13. It came about that as he was at the gate of Benjamin, the officer holding the oversight, whose name was Urijah, the son of Shelemiah, the son of Hananiah, was there. Uh-oh. Why? Well, this is the grandson of Hananiah. Who's he? Do you remember just prior to this, when Jeremiah was walking before the elders of Israel at the gate, and the false prophet Hananiah was there, Jeremiah comes up with this wooden yoke on his back, and he says, this yoke isn't heavy. You take and keep the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar on your back, as Jehovah has said. Have Zedekiah remain loyal as a vassal king, and that yoke will not be burdensome. Well, Hananiah stepped forth, ripped the yoke off Jeremiah's back, and broke it in pieces on the ground. He says, that's what we think of your lies, your messages. Well, Jeremiah was then told by Jehovah to speak these words. And he says to Hananiah, because you've done this thing, Hananiah, not a wooden yoke, but God is going to give this nation a yoke of iron. It will be crushingly burdensome. And you're going to die for what you've done within the year. And he died. Now, this is Hananiah's grandson. And you can believe he was waiting for an opportunity to get back at Jeremiah from what we read now that transpires. At once he took hold of Jeremiah the prophet, saying, it is to the Chaldeans you're falling away. Well, Jeremiah said, it's false. I'm not going away to the Chaldeans. In other words, you know better than that. But he didn't listen to him. Urijah kept hold of Jeremiah and brought him to the princes. Now, the princes would be the military leaders among the tribes, yet faithful to God, there in Benjamin and Judah. Well, the princes began to get indignant with Jeremiah. They struck him, put him into the house of fetters, into the house of Jehonathon the secretary, for this is what they had made the house of detention. When Jeremiah came into the house of the cistern and into the vaulted rooms, he continued dwelling there many days. They took over the home of Jehonathon there and used the cellar, in our terminology, which is cold and damp, where many times they had their personal cistern and kept things cool. Well, they used it as a jail and stuck Jeremiah down there in those unhealthy circumstances. Now, King Zedekiah hears about it. King Zedekiah knows he's a prophet of Jehovah, Jeremiah. But he never had the courage to stand up with Jeremiah before the elders of Israel and the military rulers. So in verse 17, King Zedekiah proceeded to send and take him, and the king began asking him questions in his house in a place of concealment. And he went on to say, "Does there exist a word from Jehovah?" To this Jeremiah said, "There does exist. Into the hand of the king of Babylon you'll be given." Well, then Jeremiah said to the king of Zedekiah, "In what way have I sinned against you, and against your servants and against this people, so that you men have put me into the house of detention? Where are your prophets who prophesy to you, saying, 'The king of Babylon will not come against you men and against this land'? They're the ones that should be in jail. The king of Babylon's out there now with his armies. You've got me in jail. What did I do?" And something interesting then transpires. Jeremiah, after making that point, goes on and says, "Now listen, please, my lord and the king. May my request for favor please fall before you. Don't send me back to the house of Jehonathan the secretary, that I may not die there." So accordingly, King Zedekiah commanded, and they put Jeremiah in the custody of the courtyard of the guard, and there was a giving him of a round loaf of bread daily from the street of the bakers. He wasn't going to starve like he was down in that dungeon until the bread was exhausted in the city. Now, reason we pause and ask, what was that? Think about what just happened. Jeremiah here, we thought he was a bold, fearless prophet. Well, he was. He took the message of God. He didn't compromise it, not even to the face of Zedekiah. But when it come to the opportunity of saving his life, he sought it. So we have a little insight into Jeremiah the man. The prophet, bold as can be. The man, if he could save his life, he was going to do it. You today are the same way, all of us. We're given a message by Jehovah God, and we proclaim it boldly because we believe in it. But if our life were actually threatened, we would try to save it, wouldn't we? We're not persons who walk around with a martyr complex and desire persecution or death. And it helps us appreciate the fact that we're just trying to do what Jeremiah did. Do the will of God. Preach the message as distasteful as it might be to persons. The Jeremiah class today, the anointed, has taken a message that's taken a great deal of courage to individuals. But they're still men. We've taken a message, there's a great crowd of other sheep who associate with them. It's taken a lot of boldness, but we're still men. We're still flesh. And it comes right down to our life. We still want it, don't we? What happened? Well, 38th chapter, Jeremiah, even after pleading with his life, in the second verse does he say, "Well, I got through that one, I'll keep quiet now." No. He continues to roar out in the courtyard of the guard, "This is what Jehovah has said." This is the second verse, 38th chapter. "The one continuing to dwell in this city is the one that will die by the sword, and by the famine, and by the pestilence. But the one going out to the Chaldeans is the one that will keep living, and certainly come to have his soul as spoil, and alive." Now notice, he didn't say you'll keep your homes and your business. To those Jews, he says you'll keep your soul. That's all God will give you is your soul. But you'll at least be alive. Well, now this didn't go over. Military rulers would be around that courtyard. And in verse 4, the princes began to say to the king, "Let this man please be put to death." That's how he's weakening the hands of the men of war who are left remaining in this city, in the hands of all the people, by speaking to them according to these words. This man isn't seeking the peace of the people, but calamity. So the King Zedekiah, again showing his weakness, says, "Look, he's in your hands. There's nothing at all at which the king himself can prevail against you." Well, they took Jeremiah, threw him into the cistern of Malchijah, the son of the king, which was in the courtyard of the guard, and they let Jeremiah down by means of ropes. And in the cistern there was no water, but mire, and Jeremiah began to sink down into the mire. Well, Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian, a man who was a eunuch, let's pause there. Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian, The nation of Ethiopia was given its name by the Greeks when they conquered it, and they called it Ethiopia. The region of burnt faces, it is translated literally. Well, now this Ethiopian was an official. In the Hebrew is Saris, closely related to Sarim. Not a physical eunuch, or he wouldn't have had the authority to approach the king on matters that he did approach him. What happened? Well, Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, who was a eunuch and who was in the house of the king, got to hear that they had put Jeremiah into the cistern. Well, the king was sitting at the gate of Benjamin. Why? No doubt directing military maneuvers. He wouldn't have to be at the gate to the east, would he? No, because there was the natural protection to the city there of the Kidron Valley and the great walls of the city. Then south of the city there was the valley of Gehenna or Hinnom. That was a natural barrier. So all they have to do is protect the west and the north. Well, here he was at the gate of Benjamin at the north, no doubt guiding military maneuvers. Now, do you bother a king when he's right in the middle of warfare? That took courage. Could have cost him his life, but he went, even at the risk of the rulers, the military princes, killing him. Well, he went up to the king in verse 9 and he says, "My lord the king, these men have done bad in all that they've done to Jeremiah, the prophet, whom they've thrown into the cistern. He'll die where he is because of the famine. For there's no more bread in the city, and only the royalty, so he had the bread that was left." Well, then the king commanded Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, "Go, take in your charge from this place 30 men and get Jeremiah the prophet out of the cistern before he dies." So Ebed-Melech had the courage to stand up with Jeremiah, and he rescued him. Now today, there has been a class of persons who have been courageous enough to take the ridicule and abuse that comes with representing Jehovah God and his son Jesus along with the anointed, and declaring the message, Nathash Nathatz. God is going to uproot and tear down this old system, including your kingdom. It's taken great courage, and it's cost the lives of many of the Ebed-Melech class, the great crowd of other sheep. Well, in this case, did Jeremiah now say, "Well, I got through that one too. I learned my lesson. Let's get out of here"? No. It's incredible what boldness this man displayed, but in verse 17, Jeremiah now said to Zedekiah the king, "This is what Jehovah, the God of armies, the God of Israel, has said. If you will without fail go out to the princes of the king of Babylon, your soul will also certainly keep living, and the city itself will not be burned with fire, and you yourself and your household will certainly keep living. But if you do not go out to the princes of the king of Babylon, this city will certainly be given into the hand of the Chaldeans, and they will burn it with fire, and you'll not escape out of their hand." Well, King Zedekiah said to Jeremiah, "Well, I'm afraid of the Jews." He was more frightened of those Jewish leaders than he was God. Fear petrified him, so he didn't listen. Well, the inevitable happened, chapter 39. He makes a break for it. Did he get away? Well, verse 5, the military force of the Chaldeans went chasing after them, and they got to overtake Zedekiah in the desert plains of Jericho. They had gotten away for some time. They were chased for some 19 miles through the barren waste, but they were caught. And then what happened? Well, we read in verse 6, the king of Babylon proceeded to slaughter the sons of Zedekiah and Riblah before his eyes, and all the nobles of Judah. The king of Babylon slaughtered, and the eyes of Zedekiah he blinded, after which he bound him with copper fetters in order to bring him to Babylon. Think about this a little bit. Why did he have him blinded? And why after the death of his sons? Blindness is bad enough, but there was a reason after the death of his sons. By the way, they would blind him by heating a spear or a piece of copper and then jab it into the eye sockets, although some reliefs show the Babylonians and Assyrians, the kings would actually reach in with their hands and pluck the eyeball out. Either way, it was a terrible price he paid, but worse than that, what happened just before he was blinded? A terrible thing. He had his own sons brought before him and slaughtered. Now Zedekiah was in his early 30s, meaning his sons were probably in their teens. Many of you fathers could appreciate what an awful sight that would be. But then think of how much more awful it would be if, as you saw their blood spilling on the floor, then you were blinded. And that was the irony of it all. He would be punished with the vivid memory the last thing he ever saw in his life would be recounted over and over and over in his mind, and we would see nothing else ever again but the death of his own sons. Now, why draw such attention to that? Well, many of you are fathers. You have seen a man here who compromised to save his soul and his family's life at the risk of his relationship with Jehovah God, and he suffered a terrible penalty. What did he gain? Now, there may be times in the near future when you as a family man may be presented with some awful situations. The loss of your job, your livelihood, your possessions, your money, your home. And you may rationalize, well, I have to do something. I'll just compromise a little while because, after all, my family has to eat. And the Bible says we have to feed our family or we're worse than one without a faith. Well, what rationalization? Even to think we could compromise for a little while. We may get away with it for a little bit. But we never, ever get away with compromise when you look at the spectrum of eternity. In fact, we don't get away with it at all. We compromise, we're in agony of mind, and then when the crushing retribution comes, we're in agony of body. And we lose all our lives anyhow. There's no future in compromise, and if we're ever tempted in a very critical situation just to bend a little bit and compromise with the old world, particularly Gog and his nationalistic forces as they come against the New Order society, remember, Zedekiah tried it, and it cost him a terrible price. We would never want to do the same. But what about those who listened to Jeremiah? Sure, they suffered abuse, imprisonment, ridicule. But look what occurred. In the 40th chapter, those that listened to Jeremiah, the Rechabites, Barak, Ebed-Melech, and his friends, verse 12 says, after the destruction of Jerusalem, all the Jews began to return from all the places to which they had been dispersed, and they kept coming into the land of Judah to Gedaliah. That was a new governor appointed by Nebuchadnezzar at Mizpah, and they went gathering wine and summer fruits in great quantity. Sure, they suffered a little while, but what blessings there were in the future for their faithfulness. What excuse was there for anybody in Jerusalem not to have listened to Jeremiah? They all knew he was a prophet of God, but there were other forces that caused them to compromise. Many of them no doubt rationalized, well, Jeremiah's a good man, and he sure acts like a prophet of God, but after all these priests in Israel, they can't be wrong. And all the elders, can they be wrong? And I go along with what they say. God would never allow our nation to be destroyed. Jeremiah's just gone a little bit too far when he said that. I can't go along with him. But they had no excuse, because Jeremiah preached it and preached it and preached it for 40 years. Nathash, Nathats, Jehovah God is going to uproot and tear it down. Now, today, some of us may be in a similar position. We study the Bible with Jehovah's Witnesses, and we say, well, they're good people. They're trying to do what God says, and they do come to my house and they teach me the Bible. They're probably of God, but after all, can all these priests and ministers be wrong? And besides that, no, that's going just a little too far to say my country could be destroyed, whether it be in Germany, France, England, Russia, wherever we live, or United States. But is there any excuse for us when we have read in the Bible that there's going to be destruction of Babylon the Great, the world empire of false religion? When we've read the words of Jesus that he was going to destroy Babylon the Great, and he says, "Get out of her, my people." Is there any excuse when we read in the Bible, Daniel, the 2nd chapter, in the 44th verse, that God is going to destroy all the nations, every last one of them, and only a kingdom by Jesus would rule? Is there any excuse not to listen to the Jeremiah class today, Jehovah's anointed Christian witnesses and the Ebed Melechs who bring us that message? We cannot have two loves. It will be catastrophic to our future. We must decide to stand for Jehovah God and side in with the Jeremiah class of this day. Oh, but I just don't know if I could do it. Well, there's a way to do it. Let's turn to Jeremiah, the 15th chapter. If you believe it's right, it's been proven to you in God's Word, well, let's see what he says. 15th chapter and the 16th verse, Jeremiah said, "Your words were found, and I proceeded to eat them." Your word becomes to me an exultation, the rejoicing of my heart, for your name has been called upon me, O Jehovah, God of armies. What should you do? You eat the words of God. Commission that God has given us, eat it. You'll find great courage. You have been given the name of Jehovah, the opportunity to bear, and it says, find joy in it. Jeremiah found exultation, joy, bearing the name of his God, and when he heard the word of God, he ate it. Like Jesus says, my food is to do my Father's will. All right, we know what to do. Do it. Eat the word of God. You have an opportunity, remaining open there in that verse of the chapter of the Bible, because we're going to look at another verse. We've been given some work to do. We could have eaten of it, perhaps. We could have distributed a tract. Kingdom News, number 16, is time running out for mankind. Then come the tract. Kingdom News, number 17, has religion betrayed God and man? Well, if you didn't eat of those, why not eat of this? The work God has given us to do now, government by God. Government by God, are you for it or against it? Does that sound like Nathoth's uprooting and tearing down? Yes. Well, eat the will of God. And Jehovah God will give you great strength. Don't procrastinate, dilly-dally, put it off. Do what Jehovah God gives us the privilege to do. Eat his words. Make it your food, your very way of existence. And what will he do in turn? Look at verse 20. I've made you to this people, he says to Jeremiah, a fortified copper wall. They'll certainly fight against you, but they'll not prevail over you, for I am with you to save you and to deliver you, is the utterance of Jehovah. Second time we read that statement from Jehovah tonight to Jeremiah. Now, why didn't he just say a fortified wall, fortified copper wall, he states? Well, any of you that have worked with metal, you try to cut metal with a torch. You can cut steel, you can cut iron, you can cut almost any alloy, but you get the copper and you have a large sheet of that. That's hard to cut. Why? Because the heat is distributed the whole shield of copper, and it's very difficult to cut. Well, Jehovah God says he would make you like a fortified copper wall. The heat of persecution would come against you, but it would never cut you in half. You just absorb it. And God would be with you to fortify you and strengthen you. Do you believe it? Well, then, try it. Eat the will of God. He'll make you that fortified wall. And a beautiful relationship begins. The 33rd chapter, Jeremiah describes it this way. The 13th verse, in the cities of the mountainous region, in the cities of the lowland, the cities of the south, the land of Benjamin, the surroundings of Jerusalem, and the cities of Judah, flocks will yet pass by under the hands of the one taking count. You can come into a flock of God, and he will actually take count of you no matter where you come from or what kind of a background. You are one of Jehovah's sheep. Isn't that worth doing anything Jehovah asks us to do, to have him counting us each night to see that we are secure and that we are safe? Be like Jeremiah the prophet. do the work God has given us to do. Oh, well, no, that's easier said than done. You just have to understand something. I'm just not a bold man like Jeremiah. I've not ever been of the nature where I've done much with people. I've been out on a farm all my life to myself, never got near anybody. It's hard for me to talk to people about religion. Well, was it so easy for Jeremiah? Oh, yes, he was bold. We read he was so bold that they thought that Jesus was Jeremiah resurrected. But that was Jeremiah the prophet. We already found out that the man begged for his life. And we find out something else about the man, and it's beautiful. Not because it's a fact with the man that he suffered it, but we can identify with him so easily. Jeremiah the 20th chapter, let's turn to it. You can read in the translation you may have, probably the New World Translation, and we'll read you from the Living Bible, which is not really a translation. It's not that accurate from the Hebrew, rather loose in its presentation, but it's a very interesting comparison. And by the way, this is a prayer. It's listed as a prayer in the 8th book, page 1331. In other words, it's a conversation Jeremiah is having with Jehovah, and he opens his heart. He holds back nothing. Begins the 8th verse. You have never once let me speak a word of kindness to them. Always this disaster, horror, destruction. No wonder they scoff and mock and make my name a household joke. Or the New World Translation says, holding me in derision. But if I ever say I'll never mention his name again, then his word in my heart's like a fire that burns in my bones, and I can't hold it in any longer. Yet on every side I hear their whispered threats, and I'm afraid. We'll report you, they say. Even those who are my friends are watching me, just waiting for a fatal slip. He'll trap himself, they say, and we'll get our revenge upon him. Well, now, what's this all about? Did Jeremiah find great glee in taking that message to uproot and tear down Nathosh and the thoughts? It was hard for him. Did he revel in the ridicule? No, it was difficult for him to take. It discouraged him at times. But when he got discouraged, what was the reason for it? Did you notice who he was thinking about? He says, me. Did you see there? They're holding me in derision all day long, or they scoff at me, making my name a household joke. Now, if we're finding that a message God has given us is hard to share with people, maybe it's because at the moment we're thinking of me. Think of the message. Think of the people, their future. Think of our great God, the great issues at stake. The devil has said, you'll never serve Jehovah. Now the issue becomes more clear-cut. Oh, the devil's not going to be right. I love my God, and I'm going to obey his commandments. Well, now Jeremiah got off of himself, and look what he continued to pray as he thought about his conversation with Jehovah God. He goes on to say in the 11th verse, now Jehovah was with me like a terrible mighty man. In other words, what am I thinking about? Why am I worried? That's why the very ones persecuting me will stumble and not prevail. They'll be certainly the ones put to much shame. Well, now he got his mind off himself. And he says in verse 12, oh, Jehovah of armies, you're examining the righteous one. You're seeing the kidneys in the heart. And he now lays himself again open to the work God gave him to do. Now, you at times, all of us, will have our frustrations, our discouragements, but never think that we can do the work because of what we are or what we aren't. We can't do it. Jeremiah the prophet had the qualities that could be used by God, but down deep inside, he was still a man, and a fearful one at that, and one who could be hurt at that. And there's the great beauty. Where was the strength of this man? It was in his God, not in himself. So what we always do well to do is not rely on ourselves, what we have never done before. I'm not that type person. Put confidence in our God. There's our strength. And just eat the work he's given us to do. As we do it, we might keep certain perspectives that we find in Jeremiah's preaching, and we can also identify with his feelings again in the 8th chapter, Jeremiah the man. Haven't you, as a soul, a fleshly soul, said this to yourself as you tried to share what you know with people? Verse 5, why is it this people was a sinner, not holier or special? Sometimes we as Jehovah's Christian Witnesses have to be very careful. We go out and preach. Sometimes just because we preach, we get a little self-righteous. And we say, well, they're not going to listen. They're just Baptists over there. Or they're Lutherans. They're not worth Jehovah's New Order because they won't listen to the message. Or really, Jehovah's Witnesses are the only people worth living in the New Order of things. Well, now, we've got the wrong perspective on things, haven't we? Do we have an attitude like Jeremiah? Oh, God, forgive us all. We are all sinners. Or are we getting too righteous? When you get down to it, are any of us in this congregation or in the world a bargain to Jehovah God? Are we a great bargain to our Heavenly Father, or don't we need to rely on his undeserved kindness for mercy? Our works are merely fulfilling a command. They don't save us. We know that, and we should remember it. You mean Jehovah God loves Baptists and Lutherans and Catholics? Of course he does. What in the world has he got us out there preaching to them for? Peter says he desires that none be destroyed. And rather than being at any time of a frame of mind where we show hostility toward the community, we should go out loving them, pleading for their lives, being totally involved as blood and flesh creatures with them, not mechanical, and merely declaring denunciations. We do the work, but at the same time we have feeling for them, and we realize that we are worth nothing. No one is. We all have to rely on our Father's undeserved kindness, but we'll still take the message. But at the same time, be cautious, as did Jeremiah, to have his feeling, oh God, we all need your mercy. So today we'll keep preaching the bitter message until Jehovah makes Christendom drink the actual destruction and annihilation that the message foretells. And not only Christendom and the world empire of false religion, but also the political nations will soon suffer the executional sword of the greater Nebuchadnezzar, Jesus Christ, as he comes against this system. Now, just prior to the destruction of the nations, there will be an all-out attack by Gog of Magog. Will you fare under the pressure, or will we break? There's a chapter to turn to, 31st chapter, we would do well to remember. It relates the beauty of our God. Again, remembering, it's true, we're given the work of prophesying, but we're still men, flesh. In the 21st verse, Jeremiah says, set up road marks for yourself. Place signposts for yourself. Fix your heart upon the highway, the way that you'll have to go. Come back, O Virgin of Israel. Come back to these cities of yours. How long will you turn this way and that, O unfaithful daughter? Jehovah's created a new thing in the earth. A mere female will press around an able-bodied man. If an individual, a woman, sins against her husband, commits adultery, she seeks his forgiveness. She wraps herself around her husband and in a passionate plea begs, please forgive me. I'm sorry the way I've hurt you and what I've done. Well, now Jeremiah calls for Israel. Press yourself around Jehovah God, this able-bodied man, like a repentant woman for her adulterous course. Now, the reason there's beauty in that, you remember reading in the yearbook this year, our brothers in Germany, there were some who compromised under great pressure. But what was so encouraging to read is that even though they compromised, there were some who repented to God, and obviously he accepted their repentance, and then they died for the faith. After once compromising, just like Peter, compromising and then standing up and saying, we'll obey God rather than men. Now, if the situation comes in the future where for an instant we might find ourselves, we've compromised, wrap ourselves around Jehovah God like a woman does her able-bodied man and beg for forgiveness. Will he forgive us? That will be up to him. But seek his mercy and do it rapidly, if indeed we ever do err. Better not, however, that we do err, but remain loyal to our great God. Therefore, in the expression of the theme of our preaching, down with the old order and up with the new, nathosh and nathots. And what experiences you're going to have to tell. That great vanguard of preachers, Jeremiah, Daniel in Hebrew, or facsimile of, or Daniel, we'll come to know and be able to speak our experience to Yehezkel, Ezekiel, Habakkuk, Zephaniah. Well, now, what would we be able to say to them? That vanguard of preachers we've just read about who preached in the era of Jeremiah, yes. What will you have to tell them? Well, I don't have anything exciting to say. Well, brothers, you don't know what you're going to have to say yet. It's yet ahead of you. The Great Tribulation is going to be such a catastrophe, so catastrophic in its proportions, Jesus said that unless God stepped in, no man would live. Now, Almighty God, Jehovah, Zephaniah, or Habakkuk, in the 3rd chapter says Jehovah is going to lay bare his bow. In other words, it's been hidden in the quiver. He's going to lay bare that bow, and brothers, we're going to see phenomena, no doubt, that we can't even begin to imagine. Phenomena that's been hidden till now. The great lightning arrows of Jehovah God. Do you think Jeremiah and these other men aren't going to just hang on every word? We will have the privilege of having been through that, seeing the salvation of Jehovah. You're going to have many good experiences to tell. So do the preaching. Keep the theme ready before the community. You go door to door, nathosh. The street dogs will bark at your feet. The doors will slam, as they do when you come into the community. The shutters will fall. But you'll continue the work Jehovah has given you to do. And you'll keep in mind, your strength is not you, it's yourself. We saw the side of Jeremiah that was weak and frail. And how Jehovah God took this weak, sensitive little lamb and transformed him into a roaring lion. And he's done the same for you and will yet do in the work we've been given to do in the future. Therefore, remember the words Jehovah God spoke to Jeremiah several times we read this evening, as you nathosh and nathots, or take your message of uprooting and tearing down. They will certainly fight against you, but they will not prevail. For I am with you is the utterance of Jehovah to deliver you. And we know that he will. Unequivocally, no doubt in our mind, as we identify with Jeremiah the prophet and Jeremiah the man.